What are your future projects? What's on the burner for you?
So again, I'm finishing up now in the next month or so about a 300-page book on biblical violence, and I focus on the Canaanite genocide. So I think if you can figure that out, how to think about that, then you're well on the way to addressing the broader issue of biblical violence. And it's called Jesus Loves Canaanites. And so that's my framework is to say that some of the traditional ways of interpreting and trying to resolve those texts lead to an irresolvable cognitive dissonance, in which we have to believe we are generally called to love all people, but there was this one people that had to be eradicated by the practice we now call genocide. And it seems to me, and I spent a couple hundred pages arguing this point, that that's an indefensible position ultimately. So I put a lot of investment into that, and hopefully it should be out later on in maybe about April or May of this year.
Copen and I chatted just a little bit. God is a Moral Monster. I think wasn't that the title of his book?
That's one of them.
The issue of slavery, and it feels like so many people kind of miss the point, and they say things like, well, slavery at the time period was no worse than indentured servitude. One verse that talks about if the slave owner finds a wife for the slave and he's able to go free, that he has to make a choice between being a free man, or he stays in order to be with his wife. We talk about marriage being sacred. How do we resolve that? Marriage being sacred, but yet slavery trumps, slavery dominates that to the point where that marriage can be fractured to honor slavery. Where are you going with this? Are you viewing this as these are people trying to find God, or are these laws from God?
Well, it would be more the former than the latter.
Okay.
So in my typology of breaking up the field, I begin by looking at what I call genocide apologists. And I think just straight up, these are people who either they explicitly say this is genocide, or they defend a reading of the text which meets the legal definition of genocide, whether they acknowledge that or not. And so they're genocide apologists in my book. And so I think that's a terrible position. And then there's people like Copen who, with respect, and I'm just talking here about the genocide issue, but or the conquest of Canaan, where they try to introduce certain nuances in reading the text, which I don't think are in principle illegitimate. So he argues driving out language as primary over or displacement over language of killing, and it's hyperbolic war rhetoric, he argues, and the cities where they were actually killing everyone were actually really more properly military targets rather than civilian settlements. I deconstruct that in my view and show that really he has, first of all, ethnic cleansing he's defending quite explicitly, but second, he actually is still defending what would meet the legal definition of genocide. It is an attempt to destroy a genos, the identity of a people. That's the primary issue of genocide, of course, not killing individuals, but killing an identity, and they're trying to do that.
Yeah.
And they're also driving people out of the land, ethnic cleansing, and then anybody left behind, they are killing. And one of the points I make in the book, I don't think I've seen anybody else address this, is if the Canaanites are really as horrible as we're supposed to believe, according to the rhetoric of the text, then all the most able-bodied people would leave all the weak, indigent people and the poor and the small infants and so on, they leave them behind, and they would be the ones that are killed, and the able-bodied ones would be out of there. So you'd have a terrible policy for addressing the Canaanites. And so the third option, and this is where you take the radical move of denying the historical correlations of the text, is the spiritualization that you have in people like Origen in the early church. And then there are some new, I call them new spiritualizers today, who are much more modest than straight up allegorizing, but they nonetheless try to say, well, really how we should read this is within the light of these texts were probably written in around the 7th century, 6th century under Babylonian oppression, and they're wrestling with what it is to be true Israel in exile. And now we can begin to spiritualize a meaning out of there. I think there's some legitimacy in that, but it still doesn't address what I think is the underlying issue, which brings me back to your questions explicitly, like about slavery. which is the underlying assumption that so many people have of the moral inerrancy of the human authors of the text. And if you sit down and actually think about it, I think it's so obvious that that's clearly indefensible. That
Hmm.
these human authors, with respect to their human horizons, make all sorts of errors. They make errors in terms of their understanding of history, of science, of theology. They're not Trinitarians, as we know. Some of them are not even monotheists. They're perhaps
Yeah.
henotheists or monolaters. And then they make errors in terms of ethics and their understanding of slavery, their understanding of polygyny as a good way to establish a matrimonial relationship, their understanding of corporal punishment, of beating people, of stoning people to death if they do something wrong, and of eradicating entire populations through Yahweh warfare, I think are all examples of morally ignoble, inferior ways of thinking. So then you invoke the idea of accommodation, but you've got to fine tune it. And so the way I think accommodation would come back to the category you raised of accommodating to error. So God allows those errors into the text. And so that's my fourth category, is a providential errantism, which I think you can have with the spiritualization of the text, so that we can recognize that there are moral errors in the text. And we're invited as the reader to critically engage with the text through critique,
Hmm.
and critiquing the presentation of the Canaanites, and maybe reading with the Canaanites, as Eric Siebert has argued. And I think that way, I mean, it doesn't answer all of the questions by any means, but it does mean I don't have to sacrifice my conscience when I'm reading the book.
Yeah. A friend of mine, an ancient Near East scholar from John Hopkins, and the one thing I asked him was, one of the arguments is that it does seem that the way the Hebrews were handling their enemies and the way they were handling slaves and so on was depraved. But the thing you have to consider is the depravity of the Moabites, Canaanites, and Hittites. That these people were so much worse. I said, "Is that true?" And he said, "Absolutely. Based on our findings and all the archaeology and research, they were not worse. These people, there were probably cultures that were much more moral and better than the Hebrews." And when he said that, I'm like, but that was my saving grace. Is like these people, because one of the arguments people say is God is leading them, and they're not ready. They're not ready to treat women as equal. They're not ready to free the slaves. So God's walking them through. They're so primal and so primitive that God needs to work with them slowly into what we would call progressive morality. That the way if we don't live that way today, we at least know what's right. We understand.
Hmm.
So his perspective was the Hebrews were no better.
So there's two different ways to think about accommodation. One is that God actually says these things, much like a teacher. I give a simple example in one of my books, that I before E except after C. The teacher actually taught that, but they knew that there were exceptions. And so it's an accommodation. But you're right that doesn't work, because if God is saying accommodating in terms of giving an imperfect principle that he'll nuance later, well, then that's fine. But this is not that, as you said. Stealing is just wrong. So you can't have accommodation in that way. What you have to have is accommodation in which God allows people to believe false things, not that God taught it at some point, but rather that he allowed them to believe false things. Greg Boyd argues that point, I think, quite well. And I think that is the way that you have to go. So, for example, Christopher Wright, in his book, The God I Don't Understand, where he talks about accommodation, he says, well, maybe God was accommodating to this practice of Yahweh war, of total war, because it was common in the ancient Near East. And so but the way that he seems to be saying it is the first type. God commanded it, even though it was not ideal. But what are some of the other things that have been common in war? Rape, systematic rape of the civilian population and also defeated soldiers, cannibalism of defeated soldiers. Those are all very powerful ways to build in-group fidelity and to dehumanize and objectify the enemy and overcome the aversion to killing. So that's why you see things like cannibalism and rape arising time and again as institutions of war. Could God accommodate to that and say rape, right? Cannibalize because he's allowing? No, of course not. That's absurd. But then to suggest that genocide is somehow not as bad, so that he could accommodate that, that's also absurd, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not to say that And so one thing I say in the book at this point is to say that there's a slippery slope here, and rape and genocide, or sorry, rape and cannibalism are at the bottom of the slope is not correct, because genocide also is at the bottom of the slope. You start off at the bottom of the slope. There's no slope to slide down. So if you can accommodate genocide, you can accommodate anything.
So let's play this out. Do you feel like it would be heretical then to say that accommodation of false thoughts or ideas continues into the New Testament?
I have a section where I discuss, like, what does it mean in terms of commitment to historical events? What is required in Christianity? Well, if you look at the Apostles' Creed, if you look at the Nicene Creed, if you look at the North American Baptist Statement of Beliefs, which I make a point of doing in the book for my own sake, is you have it's Jesus, right? It's the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's what's important it's not required to believe that there was Abraham or Moses and so on. Now, I would endorse a conservatism about history. So you only doubt something if you have a good reason to, but there are good reasons to. Now, in terms of the New Testament, what if Paul, when he talks about it's been said all cretins are liars, it does seem to me like he's expressing a kind of ignoble attitude there that I wouldn't want to adopt, and that I don't think that when he's kind of encouraging Titus, this is advice that I would give if I was training a missionary to reach out to a people group, disparaging all people from the group. Now, I know that there are some nuances in the text for sure, but if we end up saying, I think Paul got that wrong, doesn't mean he got Jesus wrong, right? So I don't think, and I mean, the point of providential errantism is that where there are errors of the text in terms of the moral or theological idea expressed by the human author, there is some reason why it's there. So it's not that it's a flaw relative to the divine intent, but that God allowed it for a reason. Now, I like movies. So one example I give in the book, I really like The Shining. And so I talk in The Shining about how there are these infamous continuity errors in The Shining. And I give one of them. So Jack Torrance is breaking down the bathroom door to get at Wendy with the axe. 1 second, there's one panel, the door missing. 1 second later, there's two panels missing. If he was a lesser filmmaker, you would say that's a goof. In fact, Internet Movie Database classifies that as a goof. That's their technical term, goof. But if you know who Stanley Kubrick is, you know he's a meticulous filmmaker, and that missing panel is not a goof. Whatever he's doing, there's a reason it's there. And when I find human errors in the text, I say relative to the divine intent of the divine author, there's a reason it's there. So if Paul does mess up about cretins, there's a reason why. And what I have to do is not try to say I'm hamstrung to vindicating his opinion because he couldn't have been wrong about anything. I have to say that if he was wrong, God had a reason to allow it, and that's what I need to explore. And so then reading it through Jesus sort of becomes the criteria.
There's a passage that talks about if a wife has a question, to not ask at church with the believers, but to wait till she gets home and ask. That can seem kind of like not really that harmful, but I would say it is. I mean, it is harmful for the wife to not be able to just ask her question. Ananias and Sapphira being struck down dead. Some people say, well, it was simply because of disobedience, but you could also say, well, it was because they didn't give their money to the church, right? It's a message, sending out a message, give your money to the church.
The first one, I mean, I would say there's certainly a good case to be made there that although because it occurs in an epistle, you have to say this is an occasional document. And within that context where women were uneducated, they just didn't have access to things the same way that man would. They were in that ecclesial context, they were asking basic questions out loud and disrupting the order of service, while then in that context, women go home. But it's not expressing the universal principle that women are somehow inferior to men and need to submit and go home and ask there. Because if you got a female PhD in archaeology or something, well, we definitely want to listen to her. And so I think that often you can find those kinds of readings that can explain things, but there are points where you can't. Ananias and Sapphira is obviously a difficult one. I mean, I had Greg Boyd, for example, he tries to argue that the message there is not that God killed them, but that God turns them over to allows them to experience their own consequences of their actions and so on. For me, I mean, I would just say rather than feel compelled to be able to explain everything, just like I don't have to explain everything in The Shining to recognize it's a great film. I can recognize as a reader that I can critically engage and push back with the text, because that is what it is to be true Israel, is to wrestle with God. The text invites us to do that. So if we have problems with Acts 5, let's have a conversation about it. Maybe that conversation we're going to have is one of the reasons that text is in there.
Yeah, I'm trying to be more sensitive to when I'm reading, and so often, again, going to the idea of white privilege or whatever, but just that when I'm reading, so often I am in the position of power when I'm reading these things, and I'm not. I don't read them as a Jew when there are descriptions that are hostile to Jews or to women, and who wouldn't want for that passage to have said instead, men, make sure women are literate, make sure they can read Torah too, right?
Yeah.
It's that simple. There's so many of these things, and the Old Testament's full of it. The New Testament has some, but there's so many times when there's just, you think of how history could have been so much more beautiful, to not focus on whether the thread was mixed with foreign thread and these things that you're very versed in. That's like, unclean animals and so on. And like, let's really get in and let's roll up our sleeves and deal with some real depravity, and how can we make this a better world? So I'm looking forward to your book. I'm glad you're going to solve all this for us.
That book's written for me, ultimately, right? It's I want to have, from my own satisfaction, an account, and I can say anyone else is interested, that's where you can go to see my view. But yeah, it's just going to be another chapter in a very long ongoing conversation.
Have you, in your research already, has your opinion changed a little or not so much?
Not really. I mean, I haven't written any. I mean, I've written a lot of little things on this, but I've been thinking about it for 12 years, and then I debated Dan Barker on capturing Christianity.
Oh yeah.
In late December, and after that, I was like, I should just write a book about it. And so I sat down starting on December 26th and started writing, and so I'm almost done now. So it was kind of all up in my head, and it was just a matter of getting it onto paper. What I have done is come up with all sorts of, I think, helpful examples and illustrations of points, but I didn't have any major changes.
Yeah.
I did obviously clarify things as I went.
Are you sourcing Code of Hammurabi and other ancient Near East cultures and the borrowing and the back and forth, or are you viewing it kind of isolated?
The main focus of my book is to propose a approach to the text that is based upon a very, I think, a simple but intuitive model of moral intuitive reflection. So that, to go back to stories, a very good and powerful way to clarify our thoughts as to what is and is not possibly a moral action is to give a concrete model of what would be constituted by the commission of that action. So I have in one chapter, I give examples from World War II and the bombing of Hiroshima and the bombing of, I think, Hamburg. And actually on the ground, what it looked like for civilians, and then say, now, what do we think of that? And then I have examples of capital punishment, concrete examples to aid people's thinking. So then that builds to the next chapter where I say the closest analog, certainly in the modern age, to what is proposed or described within Joshua is the genocide of Rwanda. And I go through multiple points as to how those two are very comparable. So then I give a thick narratival description of what it looked like on the ground and what the impact was in Rwanda of this mass close contact killing. Some of the points I make is that for this kind of killing to occur, you naturally have things like mutilation, torture, rape, and mockery of people. Because there's such a strong aversion to killing, these are all standard coping mechanisms that begin to arise to dehumanize the population and so on. Those then, unless you have special pleading, those would all have been operative under a genocide of the Canaanites. And so we would get a on-the-ground description, a closer description of what this actually looked like. I think it just becomes overwhelmingly clear, in my view, that those readings that I describe as genocide apologetics and just war interpreters like Copan, that can't be right. So then you have to find some other option. So that's really where the heart of the book is in terms of making a novel contribution, is bringing some of my background in philosophy and ethics and epistemology into this conversation.
It sounds like it's going to be a very interesting read. So thank you for your time, and I may call on you again to do a follow-up, but I really appreciate your time.
No, my pleasure. It was nice talking to you, Don. Good to get to know you a little bit.